Okay, this is a presentation on immunization exemptions for public schools in the United States, assumptions versus facts. I'm Dan Tutelo. And a quick disclaimer, I'm not an attorney. Nothing I say should be taken as legal advice. Everything I speak about is my personal opinion derived from research and is protected free speech. All links and images are used for informational purposes only. This article focuses on K through 12 immunizations, but in most states it should apply to daycare or childcare as well. Who am I? I'm just a guy that does a lot of research and connects a lot of dots, and I care about people's rights being protected. I feel public officials have a duty to protect rights first and foremost before they sit in their chairs. And oftentimes they forget that when they carry out their duties. All right. What we're going to talk about when we go through this, we're going to demonstrate, let me make this a little bit bigger, how immunization is portrayed in the media. We're going to discuss the assumptions the general public has regarding immunization, review the laws in the 50 states, explain the purpose of exemptions based on some of those exemptions that we're going to find that's different, discuss the federal government's role in enforcing the mandates, discuss Ohio's laws as an example, how to confirm exemptions in your state, and if time permits, we may go through some other examples. Let's get started. So quick, I want to show a brief video. It's 2 minutes long, just about how immunizations and exemptions are portrayed in the media.
We have mandates in many places in schools, particularly public schools, that if in fact you want a child to come in, we've done this for decades and decades, requiring polio, measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis.
Nobody has a choice because the federal government is ordering 76 million people, essentially ordering 76 million kids to take the product a year.
To attend school in your state of Nebraska, children must be vaccinated against a number of diseases. Let me put them up on the screen.
Your children will not be able to attend school without taking the COVID shot.
How can these children that are not vaccinated get into our schools? Ours had to be up to date or they were sent home.
The logic of the opinion, however, strongly suggests that the courts today would allow some form of compulsion if the conditions that we talked about were met: safe, effective, exemptions in appropriate cases.
There are some exceptions where kids can go to school unvaccinated.
One is what's called a medical exemption. So a child who is, whether that's medically fragile, whether they're on medicines that prevent them from getting vaccines.
A child may also be exempt if they have a notarized statement confirming a parent's conscientious, hard belief against the vaccination. Both exemptions are rare.
A dozen states follow the CDC's immunization schedule to set vaccination requirements for children to be educated. The Virginia Department of Health, the state of Massachusetts, says, quote, Tennessee, New Jersey, Vermont, Ohio say virtually the same thing. We could go on.
And that's it, just a overview of discussion of what you see in the media. And some of the takeaways we could get from watching that video. What are some of the assumptions about when they talk about them? So Fauci lays down the assumption that you can't go to school nationwide without being immunized. Well, we know there are some exemptions, but he certainly didn't mention any. RFK doubles down on that. He basically says parents have no choice and that essentially the federal government can order 76 million school children to get vaccinated. Chris Wallace kind of repeats what Fauci said, but at the state level. He was talking to the governor of Nebraska. There was one there about some parents wonder why some kids can go to school unvaccinated when my kids have to get vaccinated. So that parent asking that question doesn't believe they also qualify for the same exemption or doesn't know how to get the exemption. Alan Dershowitz, in a debate with RFK, says that he talks about exemptions as they may be appropriate in some cases. So the assumption there is they're not available to everybody, and they need to be evaluated and approved by somebody. Medical, the gentleman explaining medical exemptions in that quick video, they said that besides medical, there were these conscious belief exemptions that some people may be able to get, but they're rare. So the assumption is that, again, not everyone qualifies for them, and they're rare, so they must be hard to get. Tucker at the end basically was confirming or suggesting that the CDC, just like RFK said up here, the CDC, they call the shots, even though the states make their own laws, that basically their laws are linked to whatever the CDC does. So that's what we're going into. That's what I feel are the assumptions of the general public about immunizations, and the way we can clarify whether the assumptions are valid or not is we'll take a look at the state laws. So let's start looking at the states. But before we do that, I want to give a quick history of the changes in the last 10 years, because there's been a lot of flipping going on with states revoking exemptions and some that have been giving exemptions back. So prior to 2015, this is what the landscape looked like in all 50 states. West Virginia, Missouri, and Mississippi had medical only exemptions. The rest of these states had religious or philosophical or both. Then there was an outbreak in 2015 at Disneyland, and that inspired California to revoke philosophical and religious exemptions, leaving us with 3 states now that had medical only exemptions. In 2019, New York joined and was followed by Connecticut and Maine. So then there were 6 states total with medical only exemptions. In 2002, there was a case in Missouri where someone challenged the medical only law, and that was overturned. So our new landscape looks like this, where now Mississippi has a religious exemption. So there's 5 states with medical only exemptions. So what exactly is an exemption? We'll go back to those assumptions, and what I wrote here was, most people believe, well, it's something you have to qualify for. It has to be evaluated. It's got to be approved. It could be denied. Not everyone is eligible. And here's the one of the definitions I thought was most consistent with what I see. An exemption is a condition or status that means you aren't required or obligated to do something that others might have to do. So that's what those parents were saying in the news clip, that, why do those kids not have to get vaccinated, but my kids have to? My kids get sent home if they don't have their shots. So let's talk about exactly what exemptions are. So when we were looking at those states, these colors represent the types of exemptions. There's personal belief exemptions, and some of these states have both, and religious. So 15 of these states, the blue ones, have personal belief exemptions, and the rest have religious. And clearly we're dealing with, and I don't go into the territories, but they're included as well. And DC is a religious state, or religious possession. Let's continue. So philosophical exemptions. A lot of people don't realize a physical exemption is a guaranteed exemption. In philosophical exemption state, you don't have to provide any evidence of your beliefs. You simply claim that you're opposed. So back to the map again, those blue states are guaranteed. Nobody has to prove anything. So in exemptions here, they aren't for certain people under certain situations that have to be approved. They're simply only need to write on a piece of paper that they oppose it. So here are some examples of philosophical states. Pennsylvania. State law says Children need not be immunized if the parent objects in writing to the immunization on religious grounds or on the basis of strong moral ethical convictions similar to a religious belief. So it's a dual state, religious and philosophical. There is no form in Pennsylvania, state form, but in one of the FAQs on the state health website, it asks how to exercise this. It says, do statements have to be renewed annually? No. A space on the certificate of immunization is provided for this, or a parent can sign a letter and submit it to the school. That's all there is to an exemption in Pennsylvania. In Arizona, another philosophical state, the law says the parent or guardian of the pupil submits a signed statement stating that due to personal beliefs, the parent or guardian does not consent to the immunization of the pupil. And Arizona has a state form, and here it says, due to my personal beliefs. Now they use the word request, but it is guaranteed, because once they check that box, put the child's name and sign it and turn it into the school's required to honor the exemption. Texas, same thing. Immunization is not required for if the person submits an affidavit signed. Let's get rid of that. By the applicant's parent or guardian stating that the applicant declines immunization for reasons of conscience. So Texas, you have to you go on a state website and request the form be mailed to you. So I put others in here, we'll skip over them, but they all say the same thing. They're all guaranteed exemptions, and they all have a state form where you simply sign your name. Now in Michigan, you have to put a reason, but there you could just say reasons of conscience. Utah, you have to take a class online and then you fill out the form online. Wisconsin, same thing. Here's the form. It's just you check the box for religious reasons, check all the ones you have an opposition to, or personal beliefs, same thing, religious or personal. All it is a checkbox and a signature. That's the extent to which it takes to qualify. Showing up, signing your name, and checking the box. Ohio, again, Ohio has no form, but here's an example from one of the schools. You sign your name and it asks for a reason. You just put reasons of conscience, or you say conscience or religion. And Minnesota. Religious exemptions. Now, most people would think, well, okay, that's that way for philosophical exemptions, but for religious exemptions, certainly you have to prove you have a sincerely held religious belief. You must prove you belong to a church, or you have a letter from a clergy member. Someone's got to review your application. They've got to make a determination and decide whether you qualify or not. So it's not guaranteed. It could be approved or denied based on the situation. So the answer to that is actually not. In the remaining 30 states, in 29 of them, religious exemptions are handled almost in the same way as philosophical exemptions, meaning they are available equally to everyone, and parents only need to submit a statement or sign a form that indicates that they're religiously opposed. There's no request that is reviewed and either approved or denied. It is automatic on submission. Now, Illinois does allow for the school to scrutinize the application or the request and actually deny it. But the law is clear that says no student is required to have an immunization that is contrary to religious beliefs. So it appears in Illinois, as long as you state it objects your religious beliefs on that form, it will be approved. And I've seen some in records requests that indicate that. But if you live in Illinois, you'll probably want to have a discussion with the school nurse or find out who's approving those to be sure. Nebraska. Immunization is not required for a student's enrollment in any school in this state if he or she submits to the admitting official either of the following. One of those is a notarized affidavit signed by a legally authorized representative student stating that the immunization conflicts with the tenets and practice of a recognized religious denomination of which the student is an inherent member. Okay, so there it's saying you must be a member of a church, or a student that states immunization conflicts with their personally and sincerely followed religious beliefs of students. So the second choice doesn't require belonging to a church. It's almost the same as a philosophical statement. And here's the form. It's got the same wording. Put the student's name of the parent, and sign it, and then it's automatic. So we could go on. I've got the rest of these here. You can review them in the link. Virginia, same thing. It's a matter of signing a form and dating it. Massachusetts doesn't have a form, but it says as long as it's stated in writing that vaccination immunization conflicts with his sincere religious belief, they are not required. And on one of their FAQs, it states there is no official form. A letter from the parent or guardian, individual seeking exemption can be used. The religious exemption request should state in writing the vaccine conflicts with the individual's sincerely held religious belief. Tennessee, same thing. They just have a checkbox on their state form. New Jersey has no form, but in one of their laws, it actually clarifies. Now, this is one of the strongest ones I've seen, the clearest demonstrations that it's automatic and the one exercising the exemption only needs to turn it in. When a parent or guardian submits a written signed request for exemption from mandatory immunizations due to religious beliefs, the statement should be accepted and the religious exemption granted. The request does not need to identify membership in a recognized church or religious denomination or describe how the administration of immunizing agents conflicts with the student's religious beliefs in order for the request to be granted. Vermont, same thing, it's got a form. So already there, we've looked at the 45 states, and we're doing this quickly because we've got a limited amount of time, but in all the states I've checked, all 45 of those, like I said, Illinois is the only one that has authorized the schools to scrutinize the request. In the rest of the states, they are treated as automatic, as guaranteed. As long as someone claims them, they are accepted and implemented. So real quick, in that video above, we saw that, oh, before we get to that, now you may have noticed in some of those state laws that they said the exemptions can be either suspended during epidemics or those children who are not immunized can be excluded from school during epidemics. And I've seen this consistently in almost all of those states. Some people fear that that means that their child will then have to go and get immunized in order to continue going to school. But in other states, Ohio explicitly states that if a child is excluded from school during an epidemic, that the child's academic standing will be preserved, meaning there's no penalty for being excluded from school. The child's excluded temporarily until the declared epidemic is declared over, and then the child is welcome back to school. So that's something you want to check in your state before you exercise an exemption as to how that's going to affect you if a epidemic is declared. And one of the things I recommend you do is you can just write the school nurse and ask them what happens. First of all, find your state law that says that. Reference the state law in communications with the school nurse and just ask them, what's going to happen if I exercise an exemption and there's an outbreak? If my child's excluded, what are the consequences? Or ask your superintendent. So here's an example. I wrote some emails and I didn't ask them that specific question. But let's just, for example, you can email these people and get their response in writing. So here I was asking about exercising the exemption in Ohio, and I asked for their form, and they said, yeah, all you have to do is fill out the form and turn it in. So I wanted to clarify. I just want to confirm that appears to be guaranteed, right? Once the parent fills this out indicating which vaccines they're opposed for reasons of conscience, it's automatic. Under Ohio law, can it be denied, or can the administration demand proof of the claim? And this is a superintendent of Aurora schools. Our understanding is that this is all that's needed. And then he mentions you can be excluded from school. Here's a nurse. I wanted to confirm the same thing, so I emailed the school's nurse. And sorry about that. And again, I asked the same thing. So according to the form, it seems all I have to do is write this phrase, reasons of conscience, and turn it in, right? Yes, that's correct. Both questions. Well, what's the first question? That's all I have to do is turn it in, right? And it appears that it's guaranteed. Yes. School nurse, New Albany Plains School District, confirming in writing, yes, it's guaranteed exemption. All you have to do is turn it in. So this is one strategy you can use to gain confidence if you're going to exercise this exemption. Reach out ahead of time. It doesn't have to only be your school district. I asked a handful of random school districts just to get that confirmation. So something to keep in mind. Now, during that video, it was mentioned by RFK, Tucker, there was Fauci, there was a lot of assumption that the federal government is in charge of vaccination. But what Tucker pointed out there was that the states do have the ultimate authority. But here's something to point out. What we just looked at above, with the philosophical exemptions and the religious exemptions, they're guaranteed. They only need to be claimed. The form, just turn the form in. That when you hear someone on the national news telling you the CDC can implement this, or the state can implement this, or immunizations are required for schools, that essentially only applies to these 5 states: California, New York, Maine, Connecticut, or West Virginia. Now, in those states, you can consult with a physician and get a medical contraindication if there's been a previous injury. Sometimes if there's another child in the family that's already injured, they might issue one. Sometimes you can take a titer test that says you've already got the immunity, and that will count as a medical exemption. And there may be other physicians that are sympathetic that if you bring in evidence that, during a certain trial, there were so many injuries, or VIRS reports that show that there's been so many injuries, that may just be enough. So Fauci, let's go back to the video. Fauci was correct in saying that we've been mandating immunization for public school for decades, but he omitted that most states have exemptions that apply to any parent that wishes to exercise them. 45 states, the majority of the country. RFK was actually absolutely wrong on both those points. Parents do have a choice in most states. Now, if he was talking about those 5 states, you could agree with him and say parents really don't have choices in those 5 states. And he said the federal government essentially mandates that 76 million children get immunized. Now, we're going to go into detail on one of the laws below about what a mandate is, but what we've seen above is it's mandated in those 45 states, but parents have the choice. So there is some word magic going on that we need to be aware of. That mandate doesn't necessarily mean, or required doesn't necessarily mean, you have no choice. Chris Wallace repeating what goes on at the state level. The parents that wondered about their kids, they were in Texas, and Texas was up there as a philosophical state. Alan Dershowitz saying that, implying that exemptions are only applicable in certain situations, but what we saw above with the philosophical and religious exemptions is they're applicable in all situations. Everyone can equally submit them. They're guaranteed. They only need to claim them. The clip that discussed the medical and the conscientious objections, that announcer said they may qualify and that they're rare. Well, they may be rare, but that doesn't mean they're not available to everyone. Each and every parent in Minnesota can sign a form, turn it in, and it's a done deal. A deeper analysis of immunization laws. using Ohio as an example. So here's where I wanted to just dig into one law. I'm mostly familiar with the laws in Ohio, but other states are similar in wording. So going through this analysis may give you some insight as to how to look at your own state laws and build your own picture of how this whole thing is operating. So first of all, public schools and entitlement. The federal government doesn't create the public schools, the states do. And the public schools in Ohio were created by the Ohio State Constitution. And we're going to look at that right here. It just says provision will be made for the organization, administration, and control of the public school system of the state supported by public funds. Now, that isn't crystal clear that public school is a entitlement, but when we get to ORC 3313.64, 33 is education and libraries, 3313 is boards of education. It clearly states, well, it's a long law, so I'm just going to extract out the text. A child who is at least 5 but under 22 years of age shall be admitted to the schools of the school district in which the child parent resides. So under this law, once a parent proves residency and age, the district is obligated to enroll them and provide a free and public education. Well, some people argue I pay for it with my property taxes. That's not the point. The point is the school's required to take the student as long as they prove these two things. So it's an entitlement. Now, what happens with the immunization laws is we see a conflict with that entitlement, and we're going to understand what this means in a minute. So Ohio has an immunization law, 3313.67, and again, it's kind of a long law, and I'm going to just outline what's going on in that law. But mainly is what it says is, no pupil shall be permitted to remain in school for more than 14 days unless the pupil presents written evidence satisfactory to the person in charge of admission that the pupil's been immunized. Well, what just happened? I thought we had an entitlement that once I prove ages and residency, the school is required to enroll me into school and provide a free public education. And that's supposed to be based on the Constitution, that schools are supposed to be set up and administered according to the Constitution. Now, within 14 days of getting into that school, one could be kicked out of the school if they choose to exercise an exemption or refuse to be immunized. So that to me is a conflict which doesn't make any sense if we assume that these exemptions are only available to certain people and that they aren't guaranteed, that someone can look at them and deny them. But it makes perfect sense when you understand by looking at the examples above that these exemptions are guaranteed and each and every person can choose to exercise them, which means it's a choice as to whether or not one wants to be subject to that requirement, which could deprive them of their guaranteed public education if they don't comply. So here's the skeleton of the law. A child must provide evidence that they are up to date with immunizations within 14 days of starting school. And they will be prohibited from coming to school unless they're in the process of being immunized. And all these state laws that I've seen have a category for this, how you prove you're in the process, or they exercise one of 3 exemptions. A parent submits a statement indicating the child has natural immunity. Now, in some states that requires tighter tests, but in Ohio, it actually only requires a statement from the parent, but it's only applicable to 3 of the list of immunizations. A doctor submits a statement indicating the contraindication, in which case they have to list each immunization that they're contraindicated for, or they exercise their philosophical exemption and they simply decline by stating reasons of conscience. So in terms of a parent exercising the philosophical exemption, we can simplify this as a child must prove they have complied with immunization requirements, or they lose their guaranteed entitlement to free public education until they provide such proof, unless their parent or guardian declines in writing, in which case they are no longer required to comply with the immunization requirements and retain the entitlement to free public education, not conditioned on complying with health requirements. So this law, when you boil it down to this, puts the parent in control as to whether they want to be subject to this requirement or not. But as we saw from the video, the assumption going into all this is that they don't qualify unless they belong to a certain religion or can prove their sincerely held religious belief. So we could take this one step further, and this is kind of what I wanted to point out because this is what's happening in these 45 states. These 45 states have laws that say it's a choice as to whether you want to be subject to these immunization laws. And this is why I call this section deemed to have consented by default, because this is what's happened in each of these states. The General Assembly has deemed all Ohioans to have consented to being subject to immunization requirements and the enforcement of those requirements, which result in the loss of entitlement to a free public education if not complied with at the time the law was passed. But they provided an option for all Ohioans to revoke their consent at any time by exercising a guaranteed exemption. That's really the reality of the situation in each of these 45 states, except Illinois. It's my opinion. Let's put it that way. Remember, I'm not giving you a legal analysis. I'm giving you my opinion based on my research. This appears to be an example of implied consent of the governed with an option to revoke consent. So we talk about government being consent of the governed, that everyone consents to what's happening to them. This is literally an example of the government implying that you've consented, but offering you an option to revoke that consent. Now, one of the things I believe leads to these assumptions that a lot of people don't qualify for these, and the perfect example is that family saying, why did those kids get to get out of school without shots? My kids have to, or they get sent home. Well, they didn't believe they qualified for the exemption, or they simply just weren't aware that there was an exemption. So Ohio has another law. 37 is the health department, and ORC, and it's up here, powers of the health department under Department of Health. So this is the State Department of Health. This is the law that tells the schools who are required to ensure that children have met the immunization requirements. It tells them which immunization methods are approved. So the Department of Health doesn't have that authority, but they can choose which method. They can tell you which shots are accepted, what time frame they have to be, how many doses of each. That law also authorizes the Ohio Department of Health to take such actions necessary to encourage vaccination and otherwise publicize or promote vaccination. And I believe that this is one of the actions they have taken to do that is to downplay this fact that exemptions are guaranteed and available to everyone and instead emphasize the requirements. So before we finish, we're going to look at some of the states' health departments. And if you are unaware of these exemptions, you're not familiar with the state law, and you don't know where to begin, most people will go to the health department and look at the immunization section on the health department. And what we're going to find is, and I'm going to show you some examples, is they very clearly indicate which immunizations are required and also clearly make it known that if you don't comply with these requirements, you will be denied school. And somewhere they Some even omit mention of an exemption, or in fine print, they'll mention there are exemptions, consult the state law for more information. So one of the barriers to people actually exercising their exemptions are the assumptions that they have going into these websites to begin with. So if the assumption is you have to belong to a religious organization, you have to show proof, a letter from a clergy, membership in a church, all of this is going to be examined and someone's going to make a decision as to whether it's sincere enough. That's pretty daunting. And if you see in these notes or in some small text at the bottom of the form, for more information about exemptions, consult the state law, you may have already convinced yourself you don't qualify. So that's the point of this discussion, is to make it clear that chances are you qualify automatically. You just simply need to claim it. So here's an example from Ohio. When we go to the home page, we don't actually see anything on the home page. We've got to click one of the links that gives the summary. Now, this is the bottom of the page for the summary. The top of the page lists all the required immunizations. Down here in the fine print, what we're going to see is, for additional information regarding school immunization requirements, recommended vaccines, and exemptions, go check out the laws. Now, we went to check out one of those, and you saw it was a pretty long law. And the other law is long as well. So someone would have to dig through those laws to actually find the exemption, read the text, and discover what we pointed out above, that, oh, it's actually guaranteed, and you simply need to write a statement. Well, there are no guides on this website as to how to write a statement or what needs to be put on the statement. And that leaves people wanting to exercise this exemption in the dark. So in Ohio, what most people will do is they have to discuss with the school, is there an exemption? Is there an exemption? In fact, the school paperwork does, in some cases, mention an exemption, in some cases it doesn't. It's not consistent. Most schools hand out this form by the state. Let's go on to Pennsylvania. Nothing on the state's main webpage about an exemption that I could see, other than a link to an informational flyer. When you open up that flyer, what you get is, in very large print, required children must have required vaccines or risk exclusion from school. Now, down here in the fine print, it does mention a child may still obtain medical, religious, or philosophical exemption from meeting the immunization requirements. Doesn't say it's guaranteed or all children will if they fill out the paperwork. It says may, so it leaves some doubt here. It's not conclusive. But there's no information on here on how to exercise that exemption. We actually had to go through a long process to find it. I did find an FAQ on the page that had an answer, but the FAQ didn't reference the law. So to find the law, I had to go to a second flyer, which referenced a law, which took me to the immunizations law. And if I drilled down, I could find the subsection. The subsection mentions, as long as the parent objects in writing, they don't need to be immunized. But there's no information on how to carry that out, how to exercise that. Back to the FAQ, it finally gave us an answer. You can write it on the green and white card that they give you, the immunization card, or you can just give a signed letter. But still no clarity on what you need to put in your signed letter or what you need to write on that card. Now, if you read the law, it just says object in writing. So is it as simple as I object based on religious grounds? What I've seen is, yes, it's that simple. You simply need to say, I object on religious grounds. Again, you'll want to check in your state, discuss it with your school nurse, get some confirmation before you decide to follow this path. Michigan, same kind of barriers to getting the information. We've got a handout to the parents. Children must follow the laws in order to attend school. Then down at the bottom of the page, and again, it emphasizes if the child has not received these vaccines, documented immunity is required. Here we have parents and guardians choosing to decline vaccines must obtain a certified non-medical waiver form. This actually makes it sound like it's guaranteed. You can just choose to do it or not. But when we hit the link here and we go back to Michigan Gov Immunize, it takes us back to the home page where we don't see any mention. We have to click links and examine what's in the various links. I did find a waiver form if you go to the local health department page, and that's where you can find the requirements as well. All right, Nebraska. That's the one where Chris Wallace was listing, reminding the governor that kids have to get these immunizations to go to school. Well, on the state's website, we find this, a quote from the law that says an affidavit, a religious affidavit will create an exemption. It's an affidavit signed by a legally authorized representative stating the immunization conflicts with the tenets and practices of a recognized religious denomination of which the student is a member. Well, we didn't exactly go through this above, but that's not the complete law. So the health department here is mistakenly or purposely omitting part of this law, the part that guarantees anyone this exemption, whether or not they belong to a church. So here's what the law says. A notarized affidavit signed by the student, or if she's a minor, by a legally authorized representative of the student, stating that the immunization conflicts with the tenets and practices of a recognized religious denomination of which the student is an adherent member, or that immunization conflicts with the personally and sincerely followed religious beliefs of the student. So this is also reflected in the state form, which also is consistent with the state law. And I found in most states, the form is consistent. So if you get your hands on the form, that's really the battle. And most of the states, I think only 3 don't have state forms. So it's much easier. If you can obtain the state form in the state you live, it should be very clear that all you have to do is check a box or sign your name or write what the state law says. I object on religious grounds that it's automatic. But these are some of the barriers people have that prevent them from exercising exemption if they have the desire to exercise one, the assumption they have that they don't qualify, and the lack of help from the health department, the lack of clarity, and all the extra effort required to figuring out what the law says or finding the state form. So I've documented some other ones here, and we're just going to go ahead and skip those. You can go back and look at them on your own. But New Jersey has the strongest case to back exemptions, but it was the hardest to actually find. I had to go through multiple links. So that's one thing I would recommend you do if you're trying to figure out what your exemption situation is in your state. Make a document like this, take screenshots, embed them in the screenshot, save all your links, make a note as to which link leads to what. New Jersey, though, I just want to point out their state law actually says when a parent or guardian submits a written signed request for exemption from mandatory immunizations due to religious beliefs, the statement should be accepted and the religious exemption granted. The request does not need to identify membership in a recognized church or religious denomination or describe how the administration of immunizing agents conflicts with the student's religious beliefs in order for the request to be granted. Now here they're using language request and grant the request, but the law says as long as someone states they have a religious objection, their child is not required. It's conclusive and it's very clear, but they still are using this language that implies that someone is granting this waiver to someone else. And that's not the actual case. So Vermont, same situation, had to go through all kinds of hoops to get to the final form, which simply says, I attest to holding religious beliefs opposed to immunizations, sign the parent's name and date it. So here are some resources you can use to help find the immunization laws in your state. One is NVIC, National Vaccination Information Center. Go to Law and Policy, choose state laws, and what you're going to see is a map where you can click on your state. So the yellow, those are the philosophical states. Religious are the blue, but what we determined through that analysis was basically in all those states, those are guaranteed exemptions that only need to be claimed. Then you have the red, which are the 5 states that only have medical. So if you click on a state, let's just pick Ohio, for example, it'll give you some facts and it'll link you probably to the Department of Health. Now, as we showed in our example, landing on the Department of Health page is not the most convenient way to get a definitive answer about immunizations. In fact, in Ohio, it's very hard to find that information. So there's another resource. This is and the link is down below, a resource put out by the CDC that goes over the requirements in each state. Now, of course, in here, it doesn't mention that any of these are guaranteed, but what it does give you are some handy charts at the bottom in Appendix A. B. Appendix B lists all 50 states and whether they have medical, religious, or philosophical. So here's a very quick way for you to check your state and see which one you have. And in another appendix, you can bypass the health department and go straight to the law in your state. This makes it, I've checked a lot of these laws and they go right to the law with the exemption mentioned. And so, for example, if we just pulled up, well, let's pull up one that we've already got the law on. That'll make it much quicker. But let's pick Tennessee. So here's the law in Tennessee. That was pulled right out of that. And let's do a page search on exemption. Okay, well, maybe I picked the wrong one. Let's see. Sometimes it's under waiver. Oh, this is the general provisions. So we probably have to go deeper into this law. But this will get you started. Okay, except it's provided in subsection B. So where is subsection B? In the absence of an epidemic, oh, here it is. This section shall not apply to any child whose parent or guardian files with the school authorities as signed a written statement that the immunization and other preventive measures conflict with the parents or guardian's religious tenets. So exemption didn't work when we searched, but if you search religious on this page, which is control, I'm just using control F. And then I'm going to write religious. That's one way you can find it. But that still doesn't solve the problem of the form. So if my example is on this sheet, you can get it. But you know, one of the easiest ways is just look Tennessee immunization exemption form and just see what comes up. And I think down here, yes, there is a required immunizations. exemption, here it is. Children with medical or religious exemptions, religious. Now, that didn't give you the form. I have the form linked, but you may have to search for it. And it actually turns out, just look for the immunization form, because a lot of times the exemptions, there it is, Tennessee Certificate of Immunization. A lot of time the exemptions are right there on the normal immunization form. So right here, check here if religious exemption to immunization selected by parent or guardian. You check that box and that's it. You sign that box and they're exempt. So the combination of those two resources are helpful in nailing down your state. Of course, you have this document on here. There's probably a good 15 of them already documented. And in summary, I hope you found this useful. I hope we've learned now where some of the common assumptions about immunization exemptions are learned from, representations from the media and state health departments for starters. They're mainly promoting the idea that there are requirements and that children can be excluded from school if they don't meet the requirements, but they downplay or they just outright omit the fact that exemptions exist. And if they mention exemptions, they downplay them. They don't, never do they mention that they're guaranteed and that someone simply needs to claim them. I've seen a few examples, but it's rare. We also learned the idea that exemptions apply to only, the idea that exemptions apply only to certain people in certain situations, that they must be requested and either are denied or approved, at least through K through 12 or for daycare, is not the reality in 45 of 50 states. In fact, these exemptions are guaranteed and only need to be claimed, and the parent only needs to notify school. In fact, it's the states that don't allow these exemptions that are the exception. We learned that decisive factor will be regarding the actual law, and further confirming that the exemption state form, and confirming the law by reading the exemption form. So those are the two key things you need. Grab that form and or find the law. If the law says a written statement, you should be able to hand in your own written statement. And if you do, and that's not acceptable, at that point, the person who received your written statement should be telling you, no, you're supposed to use this form. And it's actually the states that have the state forms that really make it a lot easier. And if you can't find the exemption form or religious waiver form, look for the immunization certificate or the immunization form, the form where usually you list the immunizations you got and what date you got them, because that may have the checkbox on it for the option to exercise the waiver. And that's it. I'll leave some information, a way to contact me, and if you want some guidance in your state or some suggestions of how to confirm the exemption in your state, feel free to contact me. I hope you found this useful. Thank you.